Hi everyone, my name is Matt Williams. I'm the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford, and I'm going to be talking to you today about Oxford interviews. Now, I've been involved in Oxford admissions for over 10 years in my role as a politics tutor, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of my top tips and insights about how the admissions process works, and in particular, how we perform interviews at Oxford. The interview is one of the most feared parts of the admissions process, and it's taken on near mythic status as to what we supposedly do, that we put teenagers into incredibly intimidating environments and we ask them awful questions until they break. Now, as with many myths, there's an element of truth to it. In the past, Oxford academics had almost no accountability. They could decide unilaterally which students they would take, and they had, frankly, too much power. And some of them misused that power and would intimidate prospective students and would seek to take people that they thought would fit socially. Those days, thank goodness, are absolutely behind us. Nowadays, academics have to go through training before interviews. We don't interview one-on-one, so there's always at least two academics in the room. And for the vast majority of our degrees, you have multiple interviews as well. So it's no longer the case that an individual can control the outcome of your application on their own and can do so via an interview. So those days are gone. And also the idea of putting you under immense stress is way behind us because it's just self-defeating. We are in just as much interest in you getting the best out of your interview performance as you do. So there would be little point in us trying to harass or intimidate you during the interview. Otherwise, we're just going to get a lesser performance from you than we'd otherwise want. And so you need to be very clear that the interview is not meant to be stressful. Actually, many people find that when they've left the interview, they really enjoyed it because they had a chance to discuss the subject they find really interesting with people that study it day in, day out and have a similar passion for it. So I think the best thing to start off with is to just try and go into the whole process having a bit of fun and enjoying it as far as you possibly can, because that's probably the most healthy way to start off with. And also, just not anticipate that it's going to be stressful, because we will try as far as we can to avoid that being a likelihood. So that's the first thing I would say. The key things to bear in mind is, what data are we actually trying to extract in an interview? What information are we trying to take away from you? Well, what we do is that we recreate our tutorial teaching system. So Oxford has an unusual way of teaching undergraduates where we teach in extremely small groups. So my classes for politics, for example, are never more than 3 people. And they're usually actually 2 students at a time. So very, very small group teaching. And that means that we're looking for people that are going to benefit from that form of teaching. And those sorts of people can help solve difficult problems with us, the academics. They will be open-minded, they'll be clear and communicative, they will be able to adapt what they know to unusual situations. So those are the sorts of things, generally speaking, that we're looking for. There are a couple of things to be very careful about. We're not looking for someone who fits socially, so we're not looking for someone who sounds like me, frankly, who's a overprivileged middle-class white boy from London. I'm well aware of my excessive privilege, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to break the system that I benefited from. But we're absolutely not looking for people that look or sound a certain way. So don't try and pretend to be someone you're not. Don't try and downplay an accent, or, obviously you can't do anything about your skin color, and nor would we want you to. You can't do anything about certain clothing choices in some cases, so don't. Just wear what's comfortable, be yourself. We're not judging you on those things, so don't feel that you need to pretend to be someone you're not, or pretend to be very posh, or pretend to be privileged. For goodness sake, be yourself. We're not judging you on any of those things. There are specific criteria we will be judging on, and we'll take notes as the interview goes along. And typically the criteria for those notes come under 3 C's: communication, coherence, and critical thinking. Now, that's broadly speaking true of all types of interview that we have at Oxford. So let's start with communication. What I mean by this is just the ability to answer questions with a degree of clarity. So this doesn't mean clarity in the sense that, or communication skills in the sense that you're very, very confident, that you have no trouble talking to strangers, that you have a sort of rich baritone that you can project from across the room. We're not talking about that sort of communication skill, because very few people have that. There tends to be this myth again that in Oxford we're looking for people that are very self-confident, but we're not, and many of us in Oxford are not very confident people, so don't worry about that. What I mean by communication skills is just the ability to clearly express your ideas. So once you've been asked a difficult question, are you able to try and unpack it? Are you able to clearly articulate what your thoughts are on that question? That's what we mean by communication skills. So don't worry if you're nervous. Don't worry if you're very shy. Don't worry if you're looking at the ground. None of these things factor into that analysis. So that's the first C, communication. The second C is coherence. It's relatively easy to throw out a lot of ideas in response to a puzzle and to try and solve it in quite a scattergun approach. But we're looking for people that can systematically use their thinking and their analysis in order to solve that problem effectively. And so it may be that you do throw out a lot of ideas that are discordant. They don't fully fit in with each other. And what we'll likely do is we'll point that out to you. That's not a problem. That's not us saying, oh, you fouled up this interview, this is never going to work. We're trying to help you improve. And again, that's part of the interview being like an audition for the tutorial system. We're not expecting you to be perfect, otherwise there'd be no point in seeking to educate you. So don't be put off your game if the tutor says, oh, hang on a minute, you said this, but earlier you said the other. It's not a problem. It happens all the time. And we're just trying to see if you can adapt to that information and improve. But nonetheless, it is relatively easy to just throw out lots of solutions. We may pull you up on that in order to try and make sure that those ideas cohere to a certain extent. So that's the second C, coherence. The third C is critical thinking, and this is perhaps the most important. This is where you evaluate the strength of your solution relative to alternative solutions. Now, for any interview, it doesn't matter whether it's medicine, physics, maths, English, politics, etc., there will be multiple solutions to the problem at hand. And the academics will want to see you being able to evaluate the strength of your proposed solution relative to some others. Okay, so you need to be fairly open-minded. The academics are going to throw over some alternative solutions. When they do so, they're not necessarily saying, you've got this wrong, by the way, and you need to change your mind. They're trying to see how you adapt to their alternative proposition. So think about it carefully. It may be that they're throwing you a lifeline because your ideas have some critical flaw in them, in which case identify that critical flaw, adapt it to your solution, and move on. It may be that they're just trying to stress test your ideas and they don't want you to change your mind. Bear in mind that Oxford academics are actually very intellectually humble. There's a famous saying that the more I learn, the less I know. And that's definitely what I feel, and it's definitely what most of my colleagues feel, which is that the more you get into a subject, the more you realise how little you know about it. I think there's this misconception that Oxford academics are the other way around, that they are extremely arrogant and think they know everything. But that's simply not the case. We realise just how complex the world is and how puny our little human brains are in coping with that complexity. And so when we're confronted with a particular problem, we don't sort of think, oh, well, I've got all the answers, because actually we know there are so many possible solutions to that answer. And that means that we are very open-minded. When someone comes up to us and says, I've got this solution, you may not have thought of it, terrific, that's great. We might sort of prod that solution and say, oh, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about the other? But that's not us saying, oh, for goodness sake, just wait, just agree with me. I'm the oracle of everything. I know the right answers to everything. No, not at all. So we will stress test your ideas. We will perhaps help you improve them, but we're not expecting you to reach the same conclusions as us. We're not waiting for you to agree with us. Because frankly, we're not that arrogant. I know a lot of people assume that we probably are, but we're really not. Okay, so what are some good strategies in an interview? Well, the first and perhaps most obvious one is answer the question you've been posed. Now, I'm not trying to patronize here, but there are certain ways, in fact 5 distinct ways, in which people often typically fail to answer the question they've been asked. Okay, so let's go through them one by one, and they accord with 5 I's. Okay, so you can remember them relatively easily. Okay, so the first one, I'm going to use a question from physics and computer science. So this is a real past interview question. I'm going to use it to illustrate my point. And that is, the question is, can machines make decisions? Okay, so can machines make decisions? And the problem that lots of people have is that they are indecisive. So when they're asked a question, they don't actually come up with a decisive answer. So that's the first I, indecision. So when asked, can machines make decisions, the human being can't make a decision. So they'll say, oh, I don't know, maybe they can, maybe they can't. But that's not answering the question. It's tempting to sit on a fence and say, oh, I don't know, this is too complicated. But that's kind of the point of us asking it to you. So don't chicken out. If someone's asked you a question, even if you're not absolutely sure, have a crack. Because I'm afraid none of us are sure. So your guess is as good as ours. So you might as well have a go and at least try. So that's the first problem. Try not to be too indecisive. Say something that is decisive, and then you can always refine it, maybe even completely change it later. But don't, for goodness sake, just say, I don't know, because that's not good enough. You're not helping us solve the puzzle. You're just kicking the can further down the road. So that's the first thing to avoid in that particular case. The second I is incomprehensibility. This is when you just spew out a lot of complicated ideas, but you're not actually being at all clear as to what you're trying to say. So my example for this is a question from physics, which is, how does glass transmit light? How does glass transmit light? Now, there are various ideas you might want to talk about to do with the crystallized structure of glass, or its properties on the molecular level, or there's lots of various angles you could look at. But the thing is, you need to try and clearly communicate your ideas. So don't just sort of bombard your audience with lots and lots of jargon, with lots of complicated ideas and words. Try and take them step by step through your solution. Otherwise, it's going to be incomprehensible, and that will be a problem. The third I is imprecision. And for this, I'm going to use an illustration from medicine. Now, the question is, at what point is a person dead? At what point is a person dead? Now, when you've been asked a question, any question for any subject, pay very careful attention to the question wording, because the interviewer has taken a lot of time and effort, probably, usually, to craft those questions. And they appreciate it when people pay close attention to what they've asked. So if someone's asked you, at what point is a person dead? For goodness sake, focus on what it means to think of a point. Are we talking about a point in time, a particular physiological point? What does a point mean? Don't skip over that, because that is a crucial part of the question. That's a crucial conceptual element. Okay? So people will be performing badly, or somewhat badly, on that question if they don't utilize the word point in their answer, because they're being imprecise. So that's the third I, imprecision. When you've been given a precise question, provide a precise answer. And the easiest way of ensuring that you're being precise is to just reuse the question wording in your response. So if someone asks you, at what point is a person dead? You can say, the point at which their brain is starved of oxygen. And then the academics might come back and say, well, that's interesting, but it's possible for people to be, quote, brain dead, to have perhaps had a temporary starvation of oxygen, but still be, in other senses, alive. What do you think about that? And so then you could maybe talk about, well, maybe the point of death is not physiological or neurophysiological, but legal. The point of death is when the doctor declares someone dead. That actually coming up with an arbitrary point in time where we can say this person died at 1:08 a.m. in the morning is only done as a legal step, that a doctor declares someone has died at that point. But actually, it's almost impossible to find out precisely when they did die. So those are some interesting things to think about, but for goodness sake, be precise. If you've been asked a precise question, you've got to provide a precise answer. Okay, so the next thing to think about, which is very important, I'm going to use an illustration from history. And the question is, at what point will history end? At what point will history end? Which is a really weird and interesting question. Now, don't be worried about the fact that the question's a bit weird. Bear in mind that we're not testing your knowledge, so you don't need to have read lots of books about the end of history, and we're not asking you about particular moments in history. We're trying to get your sense of your conceptual and analytical sophistication. So if someone asks you at what point does history end, there's not a right answer that we're looking for. But anyway, the I that we're discussing here is inconsistency. So this is where you might, again, throw out lots of different ideas. You might say, well, history will end when, I don't know, we stop writing about it, or history might end when we blow ourselves to smithereens in some sort of appalling Third World War, or so on and so forth. But you're not giving any consistent response to the question. You're just throwing out lots of potential answers. And again, that's not very helpful when it comes to solving the puzzles in hand. So please be careful with consistency. Okay. And the final I, the fifth I, which is problematic, is indignant. Now, sometimes the questions you're asked can be emotionally challenging. It's not the intention of the academics to make you feel nervous and upset, but it can be that that is a consequence of their questioning. So, for example, this is a question from law. Is wearing a uniform a breach of human rights? Okay, is wearing a uniform a breach of human rights? Now, some people might be indignant because they think, well, that's an outrageous question. It undermines the concept of human rights. Human rights are to do with matters of sometimes life and death. So to equate wearing a school uniform with that is to downgrade human rights to something quite petty. Others might be indignant because they absolutely think that, yes, forcing me to wear a school uniform is a complete deprivation of my liberty, and I hate having to do it, and anyone that makes me do it is some sort of evil tyrant, and they need to be punished. So there are a number of ways that people could become indignant. The problem is that when you engage your emotions too much, it can make it difficult to answer the question because you're going to lack clarity, you're going to become more incomprehensible. There's nothing wrong with being a bit emotional. These are difficult, sometimes heart-wrenching questions that you may be asked, especially in subjects like law, psychology, philosophy. But just be aware of yourself and be aware that the academics are not trying to make you angry. And indeed, being angry will probably throw you off your game. So it's best to try and find a way to overcome that without losing your composure, without losing your focus. So that would be my advice in that regard, is to just be careful against indignancy. So those are the 5 I's, so be very careful with those. Okay, but the ultimate point in all of this is don't think that we're looking for the correct answer. Don't think that we're grasping at the truth, because frankly, the truth is unobtainable. Even in subjects that you may think are relatively black and white, like physics and maths, at the academic level, they are shot through with dispute and disagreement. So we, the academics, don't have access to the absolute truth, so we can't expect you to either. So don't go out into an interview thinking, I've got to come up with the correct answer, because in most cases, that's not going to be obtainable. Okay. Another piece of advice I'd have that's quite general is to think a little bit beneath the surface. Many of the questions that you'll be asked have a sort of hidden subtext to them. And often that subtext will be, how does this subject operate? Maybe what's the point in this subject? So for example, past question from English literature is, why don't English undergraduate students read the Twilight series of books? Why don't English undergraduate students read the Twilight series of books? So the Twilight series of books, in case you're unaware, are teenage vampire fiction, and they are not on the Oxford undergraduate reading list. But the question is, well, why? How do we work out the quality of literature? What is literature? What is a canon? These sorts of concepts are really important to understanding English literature. And we often take it for granted that we know what good literature is. Oh, it's Shakespeare, it's Milton. It's basically a lot of old dead white dudes. But why are they the best? And why do we sort of sneeringly disdain Stephenie Meyer and the Twilight series? Is there actually a good reason why her books are not on the Oxford undergraduate reading list? And so the subtext of the question is, well, what is English literature? And I suggest before you go into your interview that you have a long think about what your subject is, because it may be that you could weave in that analysis into one of your answers. What is English? What is history? What is maths? Is maths just a language? Is it another representation mechanism for reality? That's something that you may want to think about. Okay, so that's another thing, is to sort of dig beneath the surface of the questions that you're being asked. Okay, the next thing, somewhat relatedly, is to think in terms of how, not only what. So if someone's asked you a question, think about how you could solve that question, not only what makes the most sense. So as an example of this, I'm going to give you a question from biology, which is, why do lions have manes? Why do lions have manes? So you will be tempted to go through the question in terms of, the various explanations as to sexual dimorphism in large cats, which is completely fine. But then also think about how you could test your ideas. What sort of zoological science could you do? Could you go out into the African savannah and shave a lion and find out what happens? There'd be various ethical and logistical problems with that. So think about the how, the method, not just the substance of the questions, because that will show a degree of sophistication and depth of analysis that many students won't be capable of. My next piece of advice is be bold and creative. Don't just think along tram lines. Think for yourself. We don't have the answers to these problems. So if someone can be creative and original, then that's really exciting, and that shows someone who's got enormous potential. So many of the best interviews I've done have been where people have pushed the boat out a little bit, intellectually speaking. So, for example, the question from psychology is, do snails have a conscience? Now, the intuitive answer to that is no, of course not. But why do we have to conclude that? Why not have some fun? Why not try and convince me that actually snails do have a conscience, as far as we can tell? You would have to take charge of the question. You'd have to be clear what you mean by conscience. But I think you could do that, and it would just take a bit of creative thinking. But again, we're not expecting a particular answer. So if you can come up with an answer that convincingly makes me think that snails are conscious, great. That'd be really interesting and really powerful. So go for it. Oh, we've got a rubbish truck just next to me, so sorry about the noise. We're going to be passing soon. Okay. So my last piece of advice is to just try and enjoy it. I know that sounds a bit difficult. Oxford interviews are meant to be one of the most stressful and unpleasant experiences that anyone can do, that can take part in. But if you're enjoying it, you're actually more likely to be successful. You're more likely to share the ideas that you want to share. You're more likely to think clearly. You're more likely to get the most out of the experience. And you'll also be under the least stress, and we don't want you to be stressed. So try and enjoy it. Prepare by reading around and thinking carefully. We've got lots of past interview questions available on our website that you can look at. For goodness sake, take a look at those. Think about what I said about being clear in answering the question, being open-minded and critical in your thoughts, and you'll do absolutely fine. I hope this has been helpful. As always, you can be in touch with me. I'm matthew.williams@jesus.ox.ac.uk, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. Goodbye.